Thanksgiving in my family has always been, let us just say it's a production. It is the same disorganized schedule every year. We all pack into my parents' house, which features a small dining room that seems ready to collapse at the margins. From the second I step in the door, everyone goes through the motions. Fake grins plastered on faces, ancient grudges pulled out and dusted off, and this continual tension hanging in the air, ready to explode into a full-fledged argument. Still, I determined this year things would be different. Setting limits, visiting a therapist, and attempting to let go of this deep urge to make everything perfect for everyone have been part of my effort. Thanksgiving seemed like the ultimate exam. Not exactly known for simplicity, my family would not be an exception. I had a sinking sensation this year. Still, I came in intending well and hoped for a quiet day. Indeed, that did not endure long. The strain was evident the second I entered. By now it was hardly lunchtime, and everyone was tense already. As she battled a turkey out of the oven, my mother was in the kitchen, a flurry of agitation, yelling commands. Like a wall, the stench of burned stuffing assaulted me, and the noise of clanging pots and pans was nearly intolerable. Mom gave me a brief, distracted hug, then said in her desperate mom-only manner, "Amelia, please, just try to get along with everyone today. It's Thanksgiving. It would be nice if you could just fall in line for once." Her comments were not shocking to me. Her skill was maintaining appearances, regardless of what was boiling under the surface. Before Aunt Linda grabbed me, I hardly made it into the living room. I get ready for this every year. It happens every year. She started her regular questioning, asking whether I still worked at the same company. She finds it perplexing, apparently, why I would waste my education in a career incompatible with her concept of success. Then there was Uncle Rick, who hardly looked up from his phone to tell out, with his customary directness, that I'd gained a bit. Not even a hello? I let it drop, but my gut knelt closer. My sister Jessica emerged, sporting that saccharine-sweet smile that always marks danger before I could ever breathe. Her chirping, "So still single," brought the room quiet. "Oh, and no kids, right?" she said, her typical phrase reminding everyone she's the real grown-up with her 2 kids and picture-perfect life. Every set of eyes on me. Trying not to let her get to me, I offered her a stiff smile. My dad drew me aside between the appetizers and laying the table. He began with polite conversation on employment, but it soon changed. Naturally, my brother was once more in financial difficulty. Dad said, his voice laden with expectation. "You know, family helps family. Maybe you could just, until he gets back on his feet, a small chip in." I bit my tongue. I wanted to ask exactly when my brother had last been on his feet. The room hummed with discussion, but every word seemed to be a cleverly veiled barb meant just for me. When we sat down for dinner at last, my mother noted right away that I was not piling on the mashed potatoes. She appeared let down, perhaps slightly offended. She heaped my plate with everything I was trying to avoid before I could object, knowing for years that I have dietary restrictions, and said, "Oh, come on, Amelia, just a little. We all have to eat the same. It's family tradition," before I could object. The strain grew as dinner progressed. Recently engaged, my cousin spent most of the dinner flashing her ring and throwing not-so-subtle suggestions about my single status. Every comment seemed like a punch, and everyone appeared poised for my response. I would not, however, grant them the gratification. My mother then began to cry, speaking on how Thanksgiving used to mean so much more to us, as if on cue. She dabbled at her tears and murmured, "It hurts me to see my kids not getting along." And that's when it began. The old resentment, the same worn-out fights from past Thanksgivings we all believed we would bury. I suddenly became the scapegoat, hauling back memories I would sooner forget from years past. It wouldn't have counted whether I tried to protect myself. About me, they had all formed their opinions years before. My younger cousin, who had stayed out of the drama all evening, leaned over and whispered, "Hey, don't let them get to you. I see what's going on." It was a little gesture, but in that instant, it meant everything, just when I felt I could take no more. However, it was insufficient. Their start criticizing my obsession with work-life balance marked the last straw. I had worked assiduously to reach a place where I felt good about my profession and had a life outside of it. Hearing them laugh about it made me feel as though I was choking. I had gone in expecting a quiet evening, but beneath their unrelenting digs, I could feel myself disintegrating. I thus engaged in something I had never done before. Rising, I got my coat and walked toward the door. Just a quiet departure, no great speech or reasons. Their eyes fixed on me, the astonishment and uncertainty as I left. One after another, the messages lit up my phone before I even got to my car. Startled, they called me selfish and insisted on knowing why I would ruin Thanksgiving. Still, I felt not self-serving as I withdrew. I simply felt liberated. My phone exploded as soon as I drove off from my parents' house. I had an amazing count of missed calls, texts, and voicemails by the time I arrived home. It was as if every family member had a certain window to express their thoughts on what I had done. There was my mom's voicemail first. As usual, sad and dramatic. Her voice faltered as she questioned how I could simply leave my family in such a state. She spoke endlessly on how hard she worked to make Thanksgiving unique for everyone, and how terrible it was to see me go. Every word was selected deliberately to induce guilt. I could almost imagine her seated there, gently rubbing her eyes with a tissue for effect. Then arrived the books from my brother. He's always had a short fuse, thus his messages were angry, calling me selfish and immature for causing a scene. According to him, I'd acted like I was too good for the family, and he was quick to remind me that real family doesn't just walk out. I scrolled through his texts, one after the other, all variations on the same theme. He obviously wanted to make sure I realized how wrong I was not to hear my side of the tale. The calls from my dad arrived next. One call after another gone missed. At last he left a protracted, disorganized text. It was a half-apologetic, half-guilty journey. If things got a little out of control, he said he was sorry, but he reminded me that family holidays can be trying, and occasionally people say things they never mean. Telling me family is all we have left at the end, he concluded with a plea to maintain peace. His statement left me perplexed about what to take away. He seemed poised to ally with me, but then he would retreat into the family unity position. My Aunt Linda interjected with a text of her own, as I struggled to sort through all the texts. She continued on about how Thanksgiving is a time for family, and how I had wrecked it for everyone by leaving. She made sure to mention that I should phone to apologize, since my mother was devastated. Linda was always like this, fast to jump in, even if it wasn't her place. After that was my sister Jessica. Ironically, she said nothing at all. Not SMS, not call, nothing at all. Her quiet was exceptional, and in a sense, it was nearly worse than the deluge of texts from everyone else. Jessica was the master of passive-aggressive behavior. Hence, her silence treatment seemed to be her own form of punishment for me. I stepped back, as I knew I couldn't consume it all at once. To gain some quiet, I momentarily blocked my brother's number as well as hers. The messages were relentless, and I needed a vacation from guilt-tripping. I left a few open contacts, including those of my cousin, who had been encouraging over Thanksgiving, and my parents. I wanted just enough breathing room, not a total block of everyone. My friends dropped over the next day. When I told them what happened, they were really wonderful. Though shocked, they felt good about me for at last imposing limits. Knowing how challenging my family could be, they were glad to see me prioritizing myself for a change. We spoke, laughed, and helped me to relax after the tumult of the day. For several hours, I could ignore the family strife. Still, my dad texted once more late in the evening. This time it was shorter, more direct, and different. He cautioned me I would regret burning ties, and labeled me theatrical for barring family members. His apology from the evening before had disappeared, replaced by frustration. I could almost see him pacing about, looking for the appropriate words to persuade me to turn back. My cousin reached out, the one family member not trying to guilt-trip me, and I felt ashamed as the texts kept coming in. He apologized for what had transpired and claimed he knew why I had left. Though it was a brief note, it made me feel a little conflicted, as I felt as though I had somehow disappointed him by quitting. Still, I felt deep down that it wasn't my obligation to remain around and bear the family's treatment merely to spare his emotions. I chose to bring it all up with my therapist, who had heard me discuss my family for years. She listened to all that had transpired and urged me to stick to my limits. She reminded me that even if it meant dealing with criticism, I had the right to separate myself from poisonous relationships. Though it was difficult to hear, it served as the encouragement I needed to push on. The bitterness grew over the next few days. Reading these letters again helped me to realize that my family was not seeing my side. Everything was turned into how I had abandoned them, and nobody appeared to be interested in why I had initially felt the need to walk out. When I got a particularly nasty SMS from my mother, it all came together. Over the years, she had given a lengthy list of everything she felt I had done wrong, each item meant to make me feel like the guilty party. That was all. Along with my dad's, I blocked her number too. Though I knew they would continue to reach out, I had enough. The quiet felt unusual, yet also liberating. Spending the following 3 weeks on myself, I went no contact for the first time in my life. My phone was quieter than it had ever been, and it was a relief not to have continuous family requests. I could actually breathe for once. Before long, I understood I had an ultimatum of my own to follow. Only if they could respect my limitations would I let them back in. The door was solidly closed until then. Not long after I left that family discussion in the cafe, murmurs started. Messages from pals inquiring about what was happening buzzed on my cell. They had heard tales of my disrespect and how I allegedly had dropped out from under my family around Thanksgiving. My family had clearly elevated things, organizing extended relatives and everyone else who would listen to present me as the villain. One friend messaged me, honestly perplexed. Knowing me for years, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Apparently, my mother and sister had phoned some mutual friends, informing them I had embarrassed my parents by abandoning Thanksgiving and degraded the family by not engaging in family customs. Particularly outspoken, my sister posted cryptic comments on social media regarding treachery, selfish family members, and how some people simply don't comprehend loyalty. Though I recognized their plan, their swift turn on me was almost funny. They hoped I would cave and come racing back if enough people started to doubt my behavior, effectively isolating me. I came into one of Jessica's posts not long after. The caption of her selfie with my mother, both looking heartbroken, said, "Some people never learn to value family until it's too late." Family friends and distant relatives responded sympathetically, all sharing their own tales of family disloyalty and lost ties. It was all so deliberate, as if they intended to present me as the evil person from the beginning. To cap it all, though, I received a note from my cousin, the only one I had maintained contact with. Having heard the tales as well, this time he sounded let down and expressed a wish for me to see things from their point of view. It pained to understand even he was beginning to doubt. Previously, my last friend in the family, he was also sliding away under the weight of everyone else's interpretation of events. No matter what the actual story was, the guilt-tripping had swept across the family like wildfire, and they all appeared persuaded I was the one in the wrong. From then, the strain simply grew more intense, starting to send me long emails, each more dramatic than the previous. My parents said they had trained me to love family and respect my seniors. Every message my mother sent seemed designed to make me doubt myself, to question whether perhaps I truly was in the wrong. She said things like, "This is hurting us more than you can imagine," and "Your actions have left us heartbroken." But this time around, I would have come too far to let it collapse. By now, family friends began contacting me to let me know they had heard from my parents, and to find out whether everything was good. Some were really worried. Others sounded more critical, obviously shaped by what they had been told. I began turning away these calls. I needed nothing except not always defending myself. To exacerbate things, my mother sought means to share her side of the tale whenever she could. She even posted about it in a local community group on Facebook. One of those hazy messages devoid of direct mention of me, but unmistakably about me. She said how terrible it was to be left behind by relatives and how some children simply don't value what they have. She also said to pray for her. Based on her one-sided perspective of events, the post went like wildfire, with people who knew nothing about us contributing comments and advice. I considered answering, about publicly clearing the record, or sharing my own interpretation of the events. But the last thing I wanted was public back and forth with my family. I knew that would just cause more turmoil. I said nothing, thinking that lack of response would finally compel them to cease. Rather, their attempts grew more intense, as though they were driven to keep me in the wrong until I yielded. All the controversy eventually revealed to me who my actual pals were. Some people I believed I could rely on withdrew, obviously swayed by the family story. Others stood at my side, supporting me and defying the gossip. They did not buy in. My friend group shrank but grew stronger, and knowing who I could actually rely on gave me solace. Therapy turned into a lifeline as I worked through the decades of guilt-tripping and manipulation I had grown up with. Being the family fixer and the one who maintained harmony, no matter how much it cost me, had been my life. My therapist let me see why I had stayed in the loop for so long, and why breaking away had been so difficult. I began to realize, for the first time, that none of this was my fault, that establishing limits did not make me the selfish one. Still, my family never let up. They wanted an apology, and they wanted it shared publicly. My mother started messaging me that I clear the air and apologize for insulting the family. They clearly wouldn't be happy until I corrected myself and followed exactly their instructions. However, I was done. I wasn't going to give up my quiet merely to make them comfortable. I didn't owe them an apology for looking after myself. I therefore decided. Apart from my relative, I would go totally without contact. Though he was young and had been encouraging in his own manner, he had also been enmeshed in the family narrative. Though for the rest, I was done. Driven to at last put my health first, I banned every contact and silenced every discussion. The quiet was instantaneous, and for the first time in as long as I could recall, I felt free. Years of expectations and responsibilities had at last released their weight, allowing me to concentrate on myself, friends, and the future I wanted to create. Once I severed relationships with my family, my life felt silent. There are no more guilt-ridden calls, no more passive-aggressive texts, and no more pressure to undo whatever turmoil my family generated. The silence at first very disturbing, like waiting for the other shoe to fall. But as the days went by, I came to see I missed nothing. The surroundings of me felt different, open, even somewhat quiet. I still attended therapy, working through all that had occurred. My therapist assured me that a mix of guilt and relief was natural. Years of fixing meant that part of me felt accountable for the anarchy I had left behind. Every session, nevertheless, made clear that breaking free was survival rather than selfish. The weight of my family's continual expectations off my shoulders caused me to see my life differently. I made the decision to spend my days doing things I actually liked, things I hadn't had time for in years, mostly as a diversion, but also because I'd always wanted to grow better at creating something outside the standard microwave dinners. I registered for a cooking class. Every week, I discovered that experimenting with new dishes, sampling fresh flavors, and running across like-minded people made me enthusiastic. I was pursuing something solely for me for the first time. I also cleaned some vintage art supplies I had stashed years ago. My love has always been painting, something I used to relax. But it had been neglected over the years, lost in the rush to handle family strife. Now having free time, I started painting once more, lost myself in colors and forms, and rediscovered a side of me buried. My friendships strengthened while I turned inside. Less worry, more laughter, and a lightness they hadn't seen in me for a long time. My friends noticed. At last, liberated from the never-ending guilt trips and family responsibilities, I was present in my own life. I started slowly widening my social network, running across fresh folks at art events and the cooking class. Creating relationships free from baggage or hidden expectations was energizing. Even my employment started to change with my increasing freedom. I could at last concentrate without continual distractions, and the psychological toll family problems took. My output shot through the roof, and a few months later, my manager noticed. Along with a promotion came a confidence and pride I hadn't felt in years. It was like removing an old layer of myself and entering a version of me that was unquestioningly strong and free. The family quiet broke at last when my cousin texted me one evening. He let me know the family was still angry, but had understood that I was following my choice. He did not apologize or guilt-trip me. Although it was a minor update, knowing from him that my family was gradually beginning to respect my limit calmed my resentment and hurt. At least that seemed to be the case. A week later, my sister Jessica messaged me, something like, "I'm sorry for my part in all this. I hope we can talk one day." It felt hurried, like she was checking off an apology box rather than really reaching out. Considering how to reply, I chose to keep things straightforward. I appreciated her message, then reminded her I still needed space. She didn't reply following that, and I didn't give it much thought. Then followed an email from my mother. Describing how terrible things had been since I had left, she let out how fractured the family was without me. She enumerated every way my leaving had affected them, as though I needed a reminder of the knock-on effects my choice had generated. As I went over her remarks, I felt the typical tug of guilt, but this time I knew better. I could see the manipulation, the way every sentence was constructed to drag me back in. I just erased the email instead of responding. As Thanksgiving drew near, my friends asked me to have a holiday meal with them. Initially, I hesitated. Though I knew this was the fresh start I needed, spending Thanksgiving without my family felt unusual. When the day arrived, we cooked together, told tales, and laughed free from any underlying conflict or expectation. Surrounded by folks free from judgment or criticism, Thanksgiving was the most laid-back holiday I had ever experienced. Only real delight and companionship, no guilt trips or secret agendas. I felt calm that evening, driving home, not one I had experienced in years. Family responsibilities had kept me so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to just live without strings attached. I had been so preoccupied fixing everyone else's difficulties. I was living on my terms, and for the first time under charge of my own life. I considered the trip that had brought me here as I curled into bed. It hadn't been simple, and part of me knew there would be times when the guilt may resurface. But now I realized, no matter how much my family could attempt to persuade me otherwise, sticking up for myself did not make me a villain. The choice I had taken had altered everything, and for the first time in a very long time, I was really thankful. At last, this was my life, that which I was meant to live. Month after month went in quiet, focused on my new life, job, friends, and newly discovered passions. I would all but ignore the family conflict from my thoughts. One day then, a letter showed up. Handwritten, stamped, urgent, including my parents' return address. Their handwriting, after so much time, felt odd. Uncertain about whether I even wanted to open the letter, I held it for some time. Without their turmoil, my life had become cozy, and I was not keen to invite it back in. But the note stayed on my counter, a subdued reminder that unresolved business still persisted. I brought it up in my next therapy appointment and asked her for guidance. She advised me to read it, if only to find out whether they would really be willing to change or assume any accountability. I opened the mail and took a long breath. The first few sentences came from my mother. Her handwriting was erratic. She began by owning her apologies for all that had happened over the preceding year. Full of guilt trips and subdued digs, this was not like the books or emails she had sent prior. Rather, she admitted the manipulation and said she had not known how her behavior had changed me over the years. Looking back, she said she could see the trends clearly and knew why I would have felt compelled to leave. Always expecting me to mend things, she even admitted she had pushed me to assume responsibilities in the family that weren't mine to bear. It was as near an honest apology as I had ever seen from her. My dad's contribution came next. It was shorter, more subdued, but it shocked me. He said he had turned a blind eye to many of the problems since he believed it would help to maintain peace. He stated that he missed having me in his life, and that he was even ready to go to treatment if it would help us to mend some kind of relationship. Reading that was startling. My dad had never been one to even bring up therapy, let alone advise going personally. Then letters from my sister and brother nestled at the end. Admitting he had always taken it for granted that I would help, presuming I could do it, my brother said he was sorry if he had added to the strain. Short, and more of a general apology for her behavior during the Thanksgiving crisis and the slander campaign that followed, my sister's note. She seemed less engaged, but even her message felt a little more real than anything I had heard from her prior. At the conclusion, they suggested a family meeting under which we might all go to therapy together to sort through the problems. Saying they would value any choice I made, they left it up to me. I felt at last they might really mean it. After a few days to consider it, I sat down to write my response. I told them straightforwardly and honestly how much their actions had impacted me and the reasons I had chosen. I consented to a meeting on just my conditions. Mediated by a therapist, it would be in a neutral environment. I made it plain that my limits had to be respected going forward, with no justification or discounting of my emotions. I would not settle for a return of old behavior. They agreed, shockingly. More than I would have ever expected, they claimed they respected my need for structure and would obey my criteria. First, I came to the therapist's office first on the day of the consultation, inhaling deeply to relax. Though I wasn't sure what to anticipate, I knew I was ready to at last get heard. Shortly later, my family showed in looking anxious and settled into a circle seat. Though there was conflict in the room, for once, it didn't feel like they were getting ready to band together on me. They seemed to be truly there to pay attention. Setting ground rules and reminding everyone that the aim of the session was to grasp each other's points of view. The therapist started the session. It felt unlike the last family conversation at the cafe. This time, there was structure and a safe environment for finally honest communication. My mother began by apologizing for the pressure she had applied to me. She said she hadn't thought about the toll it was costing me, as she had been so preoccupied with keeping the family intact. She avoided trying to assign guilt or play the victim for once. She simply listened, as I related to her how her words and behavior had affected my mood. Speaking next, my dad admitted he had always swept things under the rug, believing it would be the easiest approach to keep harmony. He claimed he committed to concentrate on being more present in our family ties and regretted not acting sooner. Hearing him admit his responsibility seemed like a weight lifting, a piece of the jigsaw at last fitting. As he expressed his ideas, my brother said he had assumed I was the strong one. Hence, he would often rely on me to handle problems. He replied he never thought about my perhaps having restrictions as well. The final person to talk was my sister. Her apologies were clear, but brief. She said she now saw it had just made things worse, and that she had been mistaken to join the slander campaign. There was no yelling, no interrupting, and no discounting of my emotions for the first time. Every one of them assumed responsibility, without dodging or justifying behavior. This was clearly an honest endeavor to understand, not a means of getting me back on their terms. I felt lighter after the session finished. We most likely never would be a perfect family. We were not one either. Still, for once, I could see and hear. I walked out of the conference, feeling closure I hadn't known I needed. I chose to keep communication restricted going forward and to condition frequent family therapy sessions. This would help me to maintain tranquility and let a cautious reconstruction of our relationship. Though that was the ending I needed, it was not the one I had anticipated. At last, I could live life on my terms, with limits tightly in place. I went with friends for their yearly gathering that Thanksgiving. Just laughing and real connection, no fake grins or smoldering bitterness. It was a reminder that family doesn't necessarily have to be defined by blood. Sometimes the people we choose really embrace and accept us for exactly who we are. The path hadn't been simple. There were hurtful, doubtful, angry times. Through it all, though, I came to see the value of establishing limits, of giving my own well-being top priority, and of realizing I deserved a life free from guilt and manipulation. My narrative is not about severing ties to my family forever. It's about discovering my voice, recovering my authority, and defining family for me personally. It's about realizing that occasionally the best act of self-love is stepping away from people who sap you and toward those that inspire you. More importantly, though, is something for which one should be rather thankful.